All right, welcome back to another episode of the MD-80 Masterclass with your host Mustafa, and you normally find me over on Twitch live streaming at twitch.tv/Mustafa, but occasionally I like to come over here to YouTube and do some videos and especially some tutorials, and I really love this aircraft, and so we're plugging away at this aircraft one bite at a time. And today we are talking about the pneumatic and pressurization system on the MD-82, specifically by Leonardo for Microsoft Flight Sim. But before we dive into that, if you wouldn't mind hitting that like and subscribe button, if you've been finding these videos helpful, I would really appreciate that. Also, feel free to leave a comment down below if you notice something wrong or I missed something. Please do let me know. I've done my best to do as much research as I can here, and of course I do occasionally miss some things and call something the wrong thing, and it just happens. It's a lot of information to go over, and so it just happens. So I would appreciate your comments there in that way. If you do have questions, you can post those in the comments as well, but the best place to do that is by joining the Discord by following the link in the description below, and you can join the conversation there. Ask as many questions as you want. I'll be happy to try and answer them, and especially with this airplane, but many other airplanes too. I'm hoping to do some more of these videos for other airplanes that have been coming out, and it's just about finding the time. So here we go. Pneumatics and pressurization. So the pneumatic system is the air system, for those of you that aren't familiar with the word pneumatics, and it comes off of primarily the engines. So the engines, as they run, they obviously are compressing the air into the combustion chamber to combust it with fuel and provide a lot of heat and expansion, and push that air out the back at very high speed, and that provides thrust for the airplane. Well, how does that help us? Well, in the inner stages of the compressor, before we get to the combustor, we can tap into air off the engine and pull off very high pressure, very hot air coming off the engine, and use it to do all sorts of things. Whether that's providing air conditioning, which seems counterintuitive because the air is very hot, but it's very fascinating how that works, and thermodynamics are a fun study. But whether it's air conditioning or whether it is pressurization for the aircraft, and even in some other instances and some other aircraft will use pneumatics for actually doing mechanical work as well. Not so much on this aircraft, but it can be done. So primarily when we think of the pneumatic system here, we're going to be talking about pressurization and climate control, and that's what we're going to be talking about right now. So first things first, we need to talk about how that system operates. Before we go look at the gauges, I think it'll be helpful to kind of get an overview of the system first. And so to do that, we're going to open this up and take a look at the pneumatic system on the aircraft. So we talked about how we can pull bleed air off of the compressor stages from the left and right engines. So these are our engines right here. They've depicted the starter, which is actually inside the engine cowling, but for the description here, they've depicted it out here. We can actually, I stand corrected, we can actually use pneumatic pressure to do work on this aircraft too, and it's used to do this, to start the engines. Obviously, almost every aircraft, jet aircraft, and except now some of the newer ones that use electric starter generators, start their engines this way. But so you see these ducts coming off of here. We have the cross-feed valves. We've talked about those in some previous videos on the Maddog regarding the cockpit overview, and that's where these guys are located. And then you'll notice that they cut off supply to not only the starter, the engine, but also the packs. Now, for those of you that are new to air conditioning and aviation, what you might call the air conditioner in your car or the air conditioner in your house, in an airplane we call that a pack. And the MD-80 has two air conditioning packs. And we call them packs because it's not just the air conditioning. I mean, it's a whole system of things, and it's in a tightly, packed up package, if you will. And so they like to call them packs. So we have two packs, and you can control them very simply with switches in the cockpit as whole units, and that's why we kind of reduce them to their overall system there. So you have the left pack and the right pack. They are isolated from these cross-feed valves, but not from the engine. So if the engine's producing power and pneumatic pressure, the pack will have access to that pressure even if that cross-feed valve is closed. But if the left engine is not, and that cross-feed valve is closed, and there's no other source of power of air, then only the right pack will have access to the air coming off the right engine. However, if we open those cross-feed valves, now we can get air from that right engine over to that left pack, over to that left starter, and so on. So that's where those cross-feed valves play a role. That's where they're controlling. That's where they are in the system and how that works. Now, the APU, which can also provide pneumatic pressure, which does it the exact same way, comes off the compressor, and a GPU, which is kind of a misnomer here because we don't normally call it the GPU when we're talking about air. We'll usually call it an air cart, but sometimes it's built into the GPU. Most of the time, it's a separate air starter cart, and it's really only ever used for starting the engines with the APUs not working. But it can be used to drive the packs and stuff too with the pneumatic pressure it has. This is different than what we would think of as the big yellow hose that comes from the air conditioner that's usually mounted under the jetway or is on a separate cart that they bring out to the airplane to provide cooling before the APU is started. That's not what this line is here. We're going to see where that line intersects into the system. That air conditioning bypasses the packs. That air is already conditioned, and it's just being ducted into the plane and pushed through the air system. And we're going to talk about that later. Right now we're focusing on the pneumatic side. We'll get into the air conditioning side in a moment. Okay, so how do we move the air around the system then? So if we want air off of the APU, we're gonna ignore the GPU thing for a minute because that's very not very common. Let's put it that way. But if we have the APU running, we want air conditioned air into the plane, and we need to get it to the packs because that's how the air is going to get conditioned. Because just like the engines, the air coming off the APU is very hot. It's very high pressure, very hot. When you compress anything, it heats up. When you expand it, it cools down. And in fact, it's that very principle that the packs use to cool the air down very rapidly. And it's quite amazing. There's actually a very cool video on the CRJ pack system where it's explained in detail, and it's fascinating. I highly recommend searching that out. It's I think it was an aviation school project that these kids had to do, and it was very cool. Anyway, if we need to get air from the APU to the packs, we've got to open up some valves. So if we want the left pack available, we got to open up the left crossfeed valve, and if we want the right pack available, we've got to open up the right crossfeed valve. If we want APU air to get to the engines for starting, we have to open up those valves. So you're noticing a theme here. If we need air from the APU, those valves need to be open. The only thing the APU can do with its air, if those valves are closed, is go to the airfoil ice protection system, which may be helpful, but it won't start our engines and it won't cool or heat our plane. So when you're using the APU, generally speaking, those valves should be in the open position. If you're trying to start the engines, same thing. Those valves need to be open because we got to get air to the starter on those ducts. Those valves need to be open. So one of the first things I do in the cockpit preparation is I always open those valves so they're ready to go, because that's one of the biggest things that people miss on the MD-80. Why won't my engine start? Why don't I have air conditioning? Why don't I have pneumatic pressure? It's because you left your crossfeed valves closed. And it's very easy to miss because they're behind you in the aircraft, and they're right here. They're these valves right here. That is open. That is closed. Open. Closed. So first thing I do, I come in here and I open those valves up. And usually when I shut the airplane down, I open them up too, mainly because I'm usually running air off the APU. But it's also nice to leave those in the up position for the next crew coming in. Okay. So we've seen our schematic for how our pneumatic air helps. By the way, you may have noticed something on this schematic that I didn't talk about, and that is the water tank pressurized system. Air will come off the packs and actually provide pressure, a positive pressure in the water tank to provide water pressure to the sinks and things in the aircraft. So another bit of work that you didn't think the air system was doing, but we got to keep that water tank pressurized. So there you go. All right. So where do we mess with the air conditioning system? Well, if you remember from our cockpit overview, that is all right over here in the lower right side of the overhead panel. It actually extends down here into this gauge right here. But the first part of this is air conditioning. The next part of this is pressurization. And in order to get air for the APU, we also have to turn the air on from the APU. And that switch is right here, this air on, off, and air condition colder switch. So now the other part of the pressures, it's kind of scattered in a few places. This is where this can get kind of frustrating, but there's a reason for it. So you have an air switch here, you have air conditioning and pressurization over here, and then you have the mixed manifold pressure, the pneumatic pressure, right over here. And you think, what in the name? Why would it be over here? Well, because this is where you're going to reference it to make sure you have enough air for starting, which is where the start switches are. So it does make sense, but it's kind of odd that it's kind of moved all over the place. So again, it maybe made more sense if that was over here, so it was a little at least closer to the air conditioning system. In the 83, of course, this area is taken up with more fuel transfer switches and aux tank pumps, so it wouldn't be practical over there anyway, but they kind of shoved it where they could to do it. So you can see right now we have no pressure on our pneumatic system. We have no pressure on our packs, so nothing is on right now. So watch this valve. I'm going to turn on the APU air. And you can see that valve go up. Now, take note. I'm going to turn that off. Oops. I'm going to turn that off. We're going to lose pressure. Now watch this. I'm going to close the valves. And we're going to turn that on. Notice we still have pneumatic pressure. Okay? So this will indicate that you have pressure for starting and that you have pressure for air conditioning, even if that mixed manifold is closed, because that pressure is not taken from the from on either side of those closed valves. That pressure is taken from the middle there. So this can be deceiving. I can't start my engines right now, and I can't run my air conditioner, but this says I have pneumatic pressure. So if this is showing positive and you don't get air conditioning and you don't get engine start, your first suspect should always be to go over here and go, oh, these aren't on. Okay. Now, something you did notice, hopefully from that diagram, was what was the one thing that the APU can do when you have those valves closed and you have air on and you have pressure here, is run the anti-ice stuff that runs off of the hot pneumatic air. So you're going to always want to make sure this valve is showing positive pressure if you're trying to run your anti-ice stuff for your airfoils. Engine anti-ice will run right off the engine. They just come right off the engine bleed air system. You don't need to worry about the mixed manifold or anything like that. It's just for the airfoil anti-ice for the left and right. You need pressure here. And if you don't have the APU running and you have those bleed air valves closed, this will show nothing, because that's where it's taking its reading from. It's getting its sensing. Imagine a sensor right here where my cursor is, right in the middle. So if I have these valves shut, the APU is off, and the engines are running, I will show no pressure here. And if I need to get airfoil anti-ice pressure, I got to open these valves. If I want engine starting and these valves are closed and I show pressure, if I need to get to the starter, I got to open those valves so I can get that air out of there. So it can be a little confusing, but that's again one of the things that trips people up the most on this airplane. You got to be aware of it. Okay, so we have pneumatic pressure. We have our pneumatic cross feed valves open, so we can start our air conditioning system. And to do that, I'm going to remind you from our electrical side, we want to monitor our load on the APU. If we're running on external power, we can monitor well, actually there is no way to monitor it. Never mind. I'm a liar. Don't listen to me. If you're on external power, you don't really need to worry about it because you're running external power. You still want to trip a breaker, but you're not going to show a load off the external power cart. It's just for the APU. So we're showing right about 70% of load, and I'm going to flip on the first pack right there. And I don't know why it moved my view when I did that. It wasn't supposed to do that. There we go. But you notice that thing jumped a little bit. This indicates a pressure amount, a PSI in the duct for the pack, and you could probably also hear the air conditioning sound changed a little bit. You actually have stuff blowing. And you can see now we're getting a little closer to 80% load on the APU. We're going to turn the other one on now. Again, it bounced, and we've got pressure over there, and we're right a little above, just barely above 80% load on the APU. So we're still within limits. We got both packs running, and stuff is going. And we can now look over here at this gauge. This is going to tell us the temperature of the cabin, but it can also tell us the temperature of the supply air coming into the cabin. And so we're supplying it at what is that, 16 or so, 17 or so C, and the cabin current temperature is closer to about 23 C. So it's not supplying air as cold as it could because it's trying to hold a relative temperature. So it's going to change the mix manifold. This is where it differs a little bit from your air conditioner at home or in your car. It's probably more similar to your car than your home. Your home has two settings on your air conditioner heater: cold and hot. And unless you have a very fancy heat pump, it doesn't have, and a very expensive air conditioner that has two-stage cooling and can turn on aux cooling and aux heating in addition for extra cooling and extra heating. It really just has one temperature it's going to output for heat and one temperature it's going to output for cool. And it will run that temperature until the thermostat says, you've reached the temperature, I'm shutting off. On an airplane, it's going to mix the air with the hot air to bring a nice level temperature, to not bring the air. It's not going to be like 40-degree air into your cabin until the temperature gets down to temp. But it can, but it usually isn't going to do that. It's going to mix it with some warm air, and it's going to try and maintain the temperature that way. So it's a little different. It's kind of similar to you moving the mixer valve on your car's air conditioning between the heater and the air conditioner. Ultimately, the air blowing out of your air conditioner is one temperature, and blowing out of your heater is another. You're just mixing them in the system before they come into the car. And same thing's happening here in the plane. In your house, that doesn't happen generally. It's just throwing one temperature in there until your thermostat says turn it off, and then one temperature until it says turn it back on, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is where you can select back between the cabin supply and the cabin temperature, and right there. You can mess with those temperatures. They're in auto by default, but you can switch them over to manual and then move them with the mouse wheel, and you can see I'm moving the valve into cold. This is the mix manifold valve, and I'm mixing less hot air with the cold air, and and so on and so forth. So if I go back over here to cabin supply, we should see eventually. Actually, that's the left side. So this is the cockpit. What we would want to see is on this side. If we move this down over to cold, this supply duct temperature should start dropping down. It will take a little bit, but it will start dropping down because we're just getting all cold air now. And if I leave this alone for a while and come back, this is going to drop kind of significantly. And that's how we move our temperature down ultimately. But normally we want to just leave this in auto, and you can see they spring back, and they're just a little bit on the other side of warm for the mix manifold there. And that's how that works. You can see our supply temperature already dropped down to about 20. Now it's coming back up as the mix manifold does its thing. So yeah, in fact now it's overreacting because it was actually at the temperature it was trying to hold, and so we cooled it down a little much, and so now it's actually bringing warm air into the cabin, and and you'll see that fluctuate as the cabin air changes and so on and so forth. Seems counterintuitive in Las Vegas right now, but it's pumping out warm air at the moment, and it should change in a moment as that changes. But this will change over time, and with the ambient temperature, it's really quite cool. So there is that. Now you also have an HP bleed off where you can do this. This will close one of the close one of the bleed air valves off the engine. If you need extra power, you basically reduce some of the efficiency and power to your packs, but still have some and get yourself some engine power back. So if it's really a hot day or you need a lot of engine performance, instead of being an auto, you can go into HP bleed off, and you basically reduce some of the power your packs get because you're reducing some of the bleed air you're getting off your system. And then obviously off is closing the bleed valves off the engines altogether and turning your air conditioners off as well. So that is your air conditioning system. Again, manual control, auto control, off, on. Normally you're just going to leave these in auto, and you always want to make sure these are on once you're taken off, because that's how your pressurization is going to work. This little switch over here, this radio rack, Venturi, and fan, the way the front the way the radio room, the avionics bay, which is underneath us here, is cooled, is through the air conditioning system and fans to draw air in and run around the computers down there that's running all this avionics and cool it down. It's very important. And so it's got 2 fans to run down there and do that. Now, the way that they heat the cargo compartment, the front cargo compartment, so if you're going to put pets under there, which they do sometimes, if you weren't to heat that when you got up to altitude, it would be very, very, very cold, and you'd end up with a frozen little Muffy when you got back to the ground again. Because like I said, the outside air temperature can sometimes get down to minus 54 degrees or so centigrade up there, and that's a little too cold for Muffin. So the way that the cargo compartment is heated in Venturi mode, in fan mode, which is where it normally is air is drawn into the avionics bay from the air conditioning system and then passed through into the cargo compartment. So the air is warmed up by the avionics equipment and then passed into the cargo compartment for heating. If cargo compartment heating is not required, you can use Venturi, and it will basically just dump that heated air over the side through a Venturi valve, and it will not heat the cargo compartment. On the ground, this switch does nothing because it is defaulted to the Venturi in the off position and all the fans running to make sure there's enough cooling for that avionics bay. But in the air, switching to Venturi will stop cooling for the cargo compartment, which again, if you're going to put Muffy down there, you don't want to do that. So usually just make sure that's in fan. That can always be a problem, of course, if the fan stops working, but you want to make sure that's in fan. That's what that is. Over here on the air conditioner shutoff override, in auto, if there is an engine failure on takeoff or landing, it will automatically shut off the packs as a precaution for not pulling smoke and crap into the system and giving you all the power you can possibly use off the remaining engine. If you need to, once you are stabilized and you need air conditioning, you can override that system and make sure you only turn on the pack not affected by the broken engine. So normally that stays in auto, but you can do that there. And then ram air, if you have a problem with your bleed air system, you can turn on the ram air. So obviously when you're moving through the air, it will force air into the cabin through a ram air system and get you some pressurization that way. Not entirely the best, but it's better than nothing. And so that's there. But again, that normally stays in off unless it's needed for catastrophic type things. Moving down to the pressurization panel, this can be a little daunting, so I'm going to do this. Okay, there we go. Usually when you turn the aircraft on, you're going to see both those lights on. And that's because when you put power on the system, you're turning the systems on one at a time, and the system's going to switch over to the standby pressurization controller. You have a standby and a primary. And when that happens, it will also do what's called a transfer lockout. And what this does is in flight, imagine you're flying along and you have some kind of an issue or problem with your pressurization controller and it needs to switch to standby. You don't want it automatically switching back to the primary that's broken, or if you switch it back to primary and the standby is the problem, you don't want the system automatically switching it back to the broken controller. And so it automatically goes to a transfer lockout, and you push this to reset that. So in flight, I'm going to emphasize in flight, you want to make sure you don't reset this because you don't want the transfer. You want to control manually whether it's in standby or primary. Not lit for primary, lit for standby. But on the ground, it's going to be lit like that. Even with the switch down here in primary, it's all going to be like switched over because of that. And so you want to make sure you come over here and cycle this and then click it to reset. If this goes on in flight, then you don't want to reset it again, but you can switch it manually back and forth. So hopefully that explained that, how that works. This is where you set your landing altitude. It's in hundreds of feet, so that 4 right there is 400 feet. When you get up here, you'll see a 10, that's 1,000 feet, and it tells you it's in hundreds of feet right here. And so there's 2 schools of thought here. I am one that usually sets the departure field elevation on this until I reach cruise, and then I will reset this to be the arrival field. Just in case we have to come back in an emergency, the pressurization will easily be set for wherever I'm going. A lot of SOP is just to set this to the arrival field. Whatever your SOP is, that's fine, but do that. And then over here, you tell it whatever the barometric pressure is of that field. So if you're going to set your departure field, make sure this is set to your current altimeter setting. If you're setting this to the arrival field, make sure you get the current baro setting for that from the METAR or the ATIS and set it there. The rate limit is for the cabin climb rate. It's in automatic when it's in the bug here, and the cabin will automatically climb or descend if the outflow valve is in automatic, which means the guard is up. And if that's the case, it will climb the cabin, generally speaking, at around 700 feet per minute max and about 300 feet per minute down max for descent. And it will do that based on your climb rate set in the air that your aircraft is doing. So if you're climbing out at 2,500 feet a minute, it's going to be close to probably 500 to 700 feet per minute on the cabin climb. If you're only climbing at 1,000 feet per minute, it's probably going to be half that. And so it will climb and do that and adjust accordingly. You can increase those limits or decrease those limits by doing that, but generally you want to just make sure that's on the bug. And then the flow rate light you can test by pushing that there and just make sure you see flow. If you see a problem, there's obviously a problem, and you deal with that there. The pressurization gauge here has two indications and two hands like a clock, but it is not a clock. The long hand, the outer scale, is the current altitude of the aircraft. So right now, I'm sorry, no, don't. It is the altitude of the aircraft, but the altitude of the cabin of the aircraft. It's the cabin altitude. So right now, cabin altitude matches field elevation because we're not pressurized, and Las Vegas happens to be sitting right about 2180 or so field elevation, and so you're seeing a little bit above 2,000 there. That's appropriate. And the inner scale shows the pressure differential between the cabin altitude and the outside pressure altitude. So right now it's reading 0 because there is no difference between the outside and the inside because we're not pressurized. So as we climb, you want to look at this gauge and make sure you're pressurizing. If this little scale never moves and stays 0, you are not pressurizing. That's bad. You're going to reach 10,000 feet and start asphyxiating people. And realistically speaking, very few people are going to be asphyxiated at 10,000 feet. You can easily drive up to Pikes Peak, which is a little above 10,000 feet, and walk around. There's no issue. But certain people will start to have breathing problems around there. And people that are already on oxygen will definitely have problems. And then as you get higher and higher and higher, eventually you start to get starved of oxygen and will start to have problems and people will start to lose consciousness. And it's very bad. So the system is designed, if the cabin altitude climbs above 10,000, you will get a cabin altitude alarm, and that will go off when the cabin goes back below 10,000 feet. So generally speaking, you want to see the cabin altitude probably no more than 8,000 feet, somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 feet at the maximum, and your differential should never go beyond this bug over here. The ideal differential, I believe, is 7.77 according to the manual, but it can go up a little bit higher if it must. Again, you're going to have issues if you try to climb above the surface ceiling of 37,000 feet, so don't do that. Otherwise, you have problems, and you'll get alarms and things like that. Okay. If you do have to go into manual mode and manage your pressurization on your own, use this valve sparingly. It wants to kind of run a little bit, even though you hit it nicely, and so it's got some inertia to it. And then you'll want to hit it and then just kind of watch the cabin altitude climb or descend. Remember, opening the outflow valve is the equivalent of climbing the cabin because you're releasing the pressure, and closing the outflow valve is descending the cabin because you're allowing the pressurization to stay inside and pressurize to normal sea level pressure. So it can be kind of counterintuitive. So you just want to watch that. You want to make sure you are climbing the cabin when you're climbing, you're descending the cabin when you're descending, and ultimately keeping that differential pressure in the scale. Again, as long as the automatic system is working, you shouldn't have to worry about it, but if it ever fails, and it can, if you're running with failures on, be aware of that. Okay. So that is the pressurization system. That is the air conditioning system for the most part. The last thing we want to cover with regard to the air conditioning system is this other schematic that I have here, just to give you an overview of how this looks, because I told you I'd talk about it. So again, here is where you would connect the ground conditioned air. So this is the air coming off that big yellow hose that's either coming from an air conditioner hanging off the jetway or a separate ground air conditioning cart. It's low pressure, preconditioned air. It's not available for starting. It's not nearly high enough PSI for that. It's like connecting your house air conditioner to the airplane. That's the way to think about it. So it comes in here after the packs and goes in the mixing chamber. So the packs do not have to be on when you're connected to ground air. It's just running preconditioned air into the system and putting it into the outflow valves. When you're running normally, though, the packs are then feeding those same valves. To the left side feeds the cockpit, and the right side feeds the main aircraft, the main cabin. You notice they can mix though, so it's primarily, but it's not in complete isolation. So because remember those isolation valves are back here, they're not up here. Okay. So just be aware of that. So that gives you a little diagram of how the the air conditioning is distributed throughout the airplane. Obviously, the way air conditioning works is it comes out over the top, comes down, the recirc fans will pull it through the side of the aircraft and recirculate some of it, dump some of it over the side, and cool the air again, and all of that, and it's very cool. One thing I did not talk about, which I need to real quick, is this air condition colder switch as part of the APU switch. You'll notice when I do that, nothing really changes anywhere. But what's happening is the way an air conditioning pack works, which is super cool, essentially it is a compressor and a turbine, just like the engine of an aircraft. And you have to think about how work is done in the space of thermodynamics. When something does work, it imparts its energy or loses its energy to the thing it's doing work to. Okay? So if you can make air do work, you can rapidly cool it down because it's losing its energy by powering whatever you're having it do work on. So you bring that high pressure, high temperature air into the aircraft. I'm going to pull up the diagram to kind of help guide you through this. So air comes off the engine here really hot and really high pressure because it came through the compressor. And it's going to rush toward this pack. And on its way and once it gets into the pack, it's going to go through a heat exchanger. It's not going to lose any pressure, but it's going to mix with very cold outside air, or at least relatively cold outside air, because if you're on the ground, it may be 110 degrees in Las Vegas, but it's still, the air is at 200 plus degrees, and so it's still a lot colder, relatively speaking. And it's going to go through the heat exchanger, so it's not going to lose any pressure, but it's going to lose some heat. So it's going to lose some heat, it's going to be naturally cooler, but it's still going to be at the same pressure. It's in a closed system, and it's going to head into a compressor. So we've taken some heat out of it, and now we're actually going to heat it back up again because we're going to compress it further into the compressor. The compressor of the pack is going to compress the air further. It's going to impart more energy to it, and then it's going to run it up and around through another heat exchanger. It's going to lose some more heat. It's at a higher pressure. It's going to lose some more heat, and it's going to go into the turbine of that compressor. So it's going to spin. So remember how a jet engine works is the engine, once it ignites that fuel air mixture, that hot gas is rushing out the back so fast that it hits the high pressure and low pressure turbines, and it runs those high pressure and low pressure compressor spools. So the engine itself, some of that energy that's not used for thrust is actually running those compressors. The same thing happens here. That energy, that air that we super compressed and took a lot of heat out of already is now going to be shot into this turbine that runs the compressor of that pack. And what that's going to do is that air is going to do a ton of work, and it's going to come out of there very cold. It can easily be below freezing cold You took what was originally 200 plus degree temperature air, and you've brought it down below freezing, not by using a refrigerant, just by using some heat exchangers and making it do a ton of work. That's the power of thermodynamics, which is super cool. And it comes out of there so cold that it actually has to run through a dryer to spin out any moisture, because that's going to be bad. That's going to freeze in the airstream now. So you got to get the moisture out of there. And then it's so cold, we got to mix it with hot bleed air off the engine because it's too cold to send to the cabin. We mix it in the mixing manifold with with a certain amount of regulated bleed air from the engine, and heat it up to an acceptable temperature and shoot it into the cabin. And that's how the air conditioning system works. It's super fascinating. And so you can be on aircraft, like I've been on an MD-80 actually, of all things, flying out of Bradley, and they had that air conditioning working so well, and the humidity was such, you could see the air coming out of the vents. Like, it was that cold. Like, it was like your breath in the winter coming out of the vents like that. It was so cold. It felt so good. They had to turn it. I remember a few people complained to the flight attendant. They had to go turn the system, the heat up a little bit, because it was getting so cold in there. It felt so good initially, but then it started to feel like a meat locker. And it was like, okay, we gotta do that. But it's amazing how that works without a refrigerant. The air is the refrigerant, essentially. It's super cool just by making it do a ton of work. So it's just air. It's not, there's no Freon or anything that's doing that. It's all that. And there's obviously a lot of regulating valves in there that make that work, and fans and things that are all helping that process. It's not quite as simple as I just described, but the basic mechanics of it are that. It's very cool. Okay, that is the pressurization system. That video went a little bit longer than I had hoped, but that is the pressurization system in the MD-80. And so between those four systems, electrical, hydraulic, fuel, and pneumatic and air conditioning, pneumatic air conditioning are kind of the same thing, that gives us a good overview for going into pre-flighting this airplane, which is what we're going to do in Module 4. And so now what I can do is we can run through our pre-flight, and I'm not going to have to explain all of those systems. We're just going to show you what you need to be checking for as we go through the check, and it will go pretty quick. So now that you have the basic understanding of what those systems are, I'm going to expect you to know that basic knowledge, and if you don't, you'll have to go back and watch those other videos. So I hope you found that helpful and fascinating. I love geeking out on this stuff. It's so cool to understand how this stuff works. If you found any of this helpful, please hit that like and subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it. Please come check me out over on Twitch at twitch.tv/Mustafa. I stream there pretty much every week, multiple times a week, mostly Flight Simulator, and many times flying this plane, but other planes as well. And I would love to see you over there. Feel free to ask questions in the comments below or on Twitch. But mostly the best way is to join the Discord and join the conversation there. You can ask your questions there. I'll be much more responsive over there as well. And I would look forward to hearing from you there. So take care, everybody, and we'll see you in the next module